Today on The World Today. World leaders gather for G7 summit in Cornwall, south of England. Texas governor promises to build border wall amid migrant surge. Plus, Israel ex-top spy reveals operations against Iran. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Joke Rogers. World leaders are gathered for the G7 summit taking place in the resort of Carbis Bay in Cornwall in the southwest of England. Global coronavirus vaccinations and climate change are expected to be the focus of the summit over the next 3 days. Let's take a look at some of those major highlights. We'll take a look at some of those highlights in the course of the bulletin, but let's take get a larger picture of what the summit is going to be like. And the VOA's senior White House correspondent, Patsy Wida Kuswara, is in Cornwall, England, covering that event. Patsy, well, it's the G7's first person-to-person or in-person talks in nearly 2 years amid the COVID-19 pandemic. What's the mood like in Cornwall?
Well, it's certainly very different than past G7 meetings. The last one that I also happened to attend was in 2018, which was in Biarritz. Last year, obviously, we didn't have one because of the pandemic. And it is very, very different. Everything's very restricted. Our media movement's very restricted. In fact, we're not even in Cornwall. We're about an hour and a half away in Plymouth because the organizers, the host country, the UK, really just want to make sure that everybody is safe. We are subjected to daily COVID testings. We are not even allowed to go out to go to a pub. So we're basically just in our hotel rooms all day or at the press filing center just to ensure that there is no transmission from obviously people who come from all over the world. And the mood between the leaders, I would say that there's certainly a realization that they really need to step up to help the world overcome this pandemic. So the mood is hopeful among the leaders. In the middle of a reminder that the world is still going through a pandemic.
And so this is also Joe Biden's first foreign trip as president, and he has touted democracy and diplomacy, saying America is back. How's that playing out for him so far, especially as he gears up to meet with his Russian counterparts at the end of this trip?
I think it's been playing out quite well for him so far. I mean, obviously, we do hear a lot from diplomats and delegation that there's somewhat a collective sigh of relief as other leaders of the G7 now deal with an American president who is more traditional in terms of his approach to multilateralism and to diplomacy. Boris Johnson, after his meeting with Joe Biden yesterday, said that it was a breath of fresh air. So definitely there's this a welcome sign that America is back after 4 years of uncertainty under Donald Trump. Now, it doesn't mean that, all the problems are going to go away. There's still hard negotiations to be discussed, including trade, including climate change, and of course, COVID-19.
Back to the summit, we know that the COVID-19 pandemic will largely be on the agenda. But what else are we expecting the leaders to discuss over the next few days?
Yes, you're right. So COVID-19 is definitely front and center. And what we are hearing is that the G7 countries are expected to announce that they will donate up to 1 billion doses of vaccines to lower and middle income countries. Now, this announcement comes at the heel of the announcement by President Joe Biden last afternoon, I should say, Cornwall time, when he said that the United States will donate 500 million doses of the vaccine from Pfizer to be coordinated via COVAX. You know that this is the UN mechanism for vaccine sharing for lower and middle income countries. So the US has pledged 500 million doses. 200 million will be delivered this year, and then the rest by the middle of next year. Not long after that announcement, Boris Johnson said that the UK will put also 100 million doses of vaccines on the table, and now we shall see how many doses will be available or will be given by other G7 countries. Other issues outside of the pandemic, of course, is climate change. This is also front and center. This is not an acute crisis like the COVID crisis, but it's a chronic crisis and an existential one. And one thing that we can expect is that the G7 leaders will agree to reduce greenhouse emissions and also do other mechanisms and steps to ensure that temperature rise does not go beyond 1.5 degrees. This is lower than the 2 degrees Celsius that was previously agreed upon. Another issue is trade, how to overcome all these trade differences between the members and how to bring the world towards a more just, more equitable, and more fair rebuilding post-pandemic. And going back to your second question about coming up, the upcoming summit with President Putin, I think it's clear that the way that President Biden designed his meetings or his series of meetings, first with the G7 and then next week with the EU and then with NATO and then meeting with President Putin, it's clear that he wants to have a strong wind behind his sails, the support of his allies, showing that multilateralism and the alliance within the US and Europe is strong before he meets with President of Russia, Vladimir Putin.
Right, Patsy, finally, we've heard reports that 7 people have been arrested after 2 vehicles were stopped and searched about 3 miles from the summit venue. What more can you tell us about this incident?
So police found several things in the 2 vehicles of these 7 people, including paint, smoke grenades, and also loudspeakers. And the suspicion is that these people have the intent of committing public nuisance, maybe creating some kind of diversion, maybe protest. We don't exactly know. But the point is that, yes, as in any other G7 meetings, there are protests going on, mostly from climate activists, and police just want to make sure that there are no disruptions to the sessions.
Right, thank you so much for that. That's the VOA's senior White House correspondent, Patsy Udakoswara, speaking to us from Cornwall. Of course, we've been talking about the G7 summit, and let's take a look at some of the major highlights of the 3-day summit so far.
Leaders of the G7 posed for the traditional family photo ahead of talks. It's their first in-person talks in nearly 2 years. Global coronavirus vaccinations and climate change are due to be the focus of the summit between the leaders of Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the United Kingdom and the United States.
It is genuinely wonderful to see everybody in person. I can't tell you what a difference it makes. We've all been going through the most wretched pandemic our countries have faced for our lifetimes, maybe longer, much longer. And I actually think this is a meeting that genuinely needs to happen, because we need to make sure that we learn the lessons from the pandemic. We need to make sure that we don't repeat some of the errors that we doubtless made in the course of the last 18 months or so. And we need to make sure that we now allow our economies to recover. And I think that they have the potential to bounce back very strongly.
Before the main summit discussions begin, Boris Johnson and Justin Trudeau met for talks following the Canadian Prime Minister's arrival in Cornwall earlier today. The 2 leaders agreed a comprehensive free trade agreement between the UK and Canada would unlock huge opportunities for both countries. He also met with Japan's Yoshihide Suga, a meeting where he expressed support for the Tokyo Olympics. Earlier, US President Joe Biden and UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson had their first face-to-face meeting on Thursday. Prime Minister Johnson says the talks were terrific and says the US-UK alliance will be called the indestructible relationship. Most of the discussions over the 3 days will take place behind closed doors.
My friend, you invite me. My friend there.
Meanwhile, environmental activists are asking for immediate action from the G7. Leaders have been campaigning in Cornwall.
World leaders have committed to being carbon neutral by 2050. That's too late. It's like rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. There's a crisis and the ship is going down, and we're just tinkering around the edges. We need to do something more.
Since the Paris summit, carbon emissions actually gone up. So, carbon emissions have gone up. I'm a grandmother. I'm desperately trying to make sure that there's a future.
In more protests, blimps depicting US President Joe Biden and British Prime Minister Boris Johnson also sailed on a barge in Falmouth Harbour to dramatize their plea. Step up vaccine deliveries to poorer countries.
We are meeting as the pandemic still rages. The G7 have announced they want 1 billion doses made available by the end of next summer. What we actually need is 1 billion doses available by the end of this summer. If we can't get ahead of this virus, we will see more and more mutations reaching our shores. None of us are safe until all of us are safe, and that's why we need vaccinations for all.
7 people have been arrested after 2 vehicles were stopped and searched about 3 miles from the summit venue. More than 5,000 extra police officers, on top of 1,500 from Devon and Cornwall, will be working around the summit.
Away from the G7 summit, the governor of Texas has vowed to build a wall on its border with Mexico amid a surge in illegal migration. Republican Greg Abbott said that he had allocated $1 billion in state funds to uphold border security. One of President Joe Biden's first acts in office was to end border wall construction. In February, the Democrat rolled back the emergency order used to fund his predecessor, Donald Trump's Mexico border wall, a key symbol of the former president's agenda, and said no further tax dollars would be spent on it. Well, our Washington, D.C. correspondent Maria BYRD joins us now for more on this. Maria, the border wall has long been a divisive issue in the United States. One of President Biden's first acts, of course, was to end its construction. Does Mr. Abbott have the authority to order a wall in Texas independently?
Thank you for having me. Yes, this has been an extremely divisive issue over the last several years now, since the Trump administration. This is something that President Trump promised, that we know that Governor Abbott is one that is a supporter of President Trump and has been in support of the wall for quite some time. The issue that we're going to be faced with is some of the land is private property, some of the land is owned by the federal government. And so as Governor Abbott looks to be able to put a wall in Texas, which will most likely be approached by the federal government, and the federal government will most likely put cases in place to ensure that it does not happen. But this is going to be one that it's not just a clear cut, this is Texas land. Some of this is federal government land and private property. And so he will need to go before the federal government. And this will definitely be potentially a case that could be brought before the federal government if Texas decides to move forward in the manner of a wall. But again, we know politics are at stake. We know that 2022 is right around the corner. And we know that the governor and all the other elected officials in Texas are thinking about what is going to be next for them and for all of their supporters that supported having stricter laws as it relates to immigration and those illegally entering the country.
Oh, Maria BYRD, thank you so much for giving us more perspective on this issue on The World Today.
Thank you for having me.
The outgoing head of the Israeli spy agency Mossad has given a revelatory interview about the country's operations against Iran. Yossi Cohen gave details about the theft of Iran's nuclear archive. The warehouse raid in 2018 ferried tens of thousands of documents out of the country to Israel. He also hinted at Israeli involvement in the destruction of Iran's nuclear facility at Natanz and the assassination of a nuclear scientist. Mr. Cohen retired as the head of Mossad last week. He spoke on Channel 12's UVDA documentary program, which was broadcast on Israeli television on Thursday night. In the Tigrayan region of Ethiopia, more than 350,000 people are said to be suffering famine conditions, with millions more at risk. A United Nations analyst, Luca Rosso, says people are at starvation levels now. However, Ethiopia's government has denied the reports of famine. Aid groups blame the conflict for the worst catastrophic food crisis in a decade, as most of the 5.5 million people in Tigray need food aid.
To be very honest, people are at a starvation level with excess mortality, wasting a very high level of wasting for children, and basically not be able to access to enough food to eat. And this is quite, and if I can add on this is 350,000 is the highest number we have recorded since the Somalia famine in 2011. We are not sure today if aid can reach the most affected population because of the conflict. The whole western part of Tigray, we did not have data on that area because for us is a black spot in the sense we don't know anything about what is happening in Western Tigray, and even for there bring assistance is quite complicated. But one of the things that is happening at the moment is that people just move away. They are displaced. So at the moment we have 1.7 million people displaced in Tigray. I think the situation is extremely serious, and. To us, the only way forward is that the party in conflicts comes to some agreement and allow the access of humanitarian assistance, because the situation will worsen.
A bus crammed with pilgrims coming back from a religious festival has crashed in southwest Pakistan, killing at least 20 people and leaving 10 others critically injured. According to officials, the bus careened off the road into a ditch in the Kak area of Khuda district in Pakistan's southwest province of Balochistan. Deputy Commissioner of Khuda, Bashir Ahmed, reports that the victims were pilgrims who were returning from a religious festival honoring a local Muslim saint. The victims were from the province of Sindh. We have better news coming out from Australia as we update you on COVID-19. In Victoria State, is now no new locally acquired cases has been reported for the first time in nearly 3 weeks. It comes as state capital Melbourne comes out of a snap 2-week lockdown after an outbreak that has seen about 90 cases since May 24. Here's more on this and other developments in our global update.
Australia's Victoria State reported 0 locally acquired cases of COVID-19 for the first time in nearly 3 weeks on Friday, as the state capital Melbourne came out of a snap 2-week lockdown after an outbreak that has seen about 90 cases since May 24th. Melbourne exited the lockdown on Thursday night, but some restrictions on travel and gathering will remain, including a rule that would force the city's 5 million residents to stay within 25 kilometers of their homes. As India races against time to inoculate its population from the virus, medical teams sometimes have to overcome treacherous terrain in some of the remotest parts of the country to reach the rural population with the help of ponies. In the northern region of Lidawat, more than 100 kilometers from the capital of India-administered Kashmir, medical teams had to trek more than 6 hours on foot and ponies to reach nomadic and shepherd tribes in the mountains. A team of over a dozen healthcare workers carrying medical kits and equipment, including oxygen cylinders, reached Lidawat. European Union countries have agreed to an easing of travel restrictions over summer that will allow fully vaccinated tourists to avoid tests or quarantines and broaden the list of EU regions from which it is safe to travel. Ambassadors from the 27 EU member states approved a modified European Commission proposal that people who had been fully vaccinated for 14 days should be able to travel freely from one EU country to another. Bells toll 600 times at the National Cathedral on a rainy evening in Washington, D.C., once for every 1,000 Americans who have died in the coronavirus pandemic. The official death toll 15 months into the pandemic is approaching 600,000, even as the national vaccination program has successfully reduced the rate of daily infections and deaths. As of June 9th, the overall death toll in the U.S. is 595,625, according to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. The World Health Organization (WHO) puts the international figure at 3,758,560.
Let's talk more about the environment as the G7 summit gets underway on the southern tip of the UK. A group of young people have descended on the venue. Among them is a 25-year-old rapper and activist, Jimmy Hall. Eager to share his talent and activism, Hall, who performs under the name Sonny Jim, delivered his plastic rap rhyme to around 30 young demonstrators who gathered outside the G7 Media Center. In his rap, he laments the consumer-driven economy and the waste products it produces.
So if anyone would like to say movement, and that's because I'm scared. I'm really scared.
Packets scattered on the grass and a mask underneath. Another empty lighter, a broken charging wire, and the ones in my eyes that help me read. Synthetic library of knowledge in the palm of your hand. But how can you expand when your head's in the sand? Slogans draw the adverse eyes in, logos tattooed to your eyelids. Have you ever stopped to think why they call it a brand? New gadgets every year, more plastic still appears in this throwaway society where sobriety is feared. Addicted to the packaging, unboxing isn't talented. Just another way for companies to bring the rabbits in.
Well, that's the world today. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Jokia Rogers.